The last generation X1 had a well-deserved reputation for incredible handling. That was because it was a rear-wheel drive compact crossover in a sea of front-wheel drive compact crossovers. The 2016 X1 is completely different because this is now more closely related to the Mini Countryman. That means this is a front-wheel drive based BMW, although in the United States BMW is being very careful and there is no two-wheel drive version of the X1. They're all-wheel drive. Instead of growing, the X1 has actually shrunk for 2016. This is about 2 inches shorter than the last generation X1 at 174.8 inches long. Even though this model has shrunk versus the last generation model, we get more room on the inside because of what's going on right up here. I found the front seats to be a little bit less comfortable than we found in the Q3. Our particular model does have the 4-way optional lumbar support that's not standard in the base model of the X1. Neither is leather upholstery. Things start out with Sensitech imitation leather. When it comes to the rear seats, it is instantly obvious that this X1 is a little bit bigger on the inside than the last generation, because I actually have an extra 1.5 inches of legroom back here. That's also aided by the fact that the front seats are a little bit higher off the ground, giving you a more crossover-like driving position. The previous generation X1 was a little bit more like a tall station wagon. The rear seat bottom cushion is also a little bit higher off the ground, giving adults a little bit more thigh support, although you can see I can still stick my hands under my legs without touching the seat. Like the front seats, the seat bottom cushions in the rear are a little bit short for my tastes. In addition to the rear seats reclining, this is actually a 40-20-40 folding rear seat back, and the center section reclines completely independently of the two outboard sections. You can also fold it down completely. Even though the X1 has shrunk a little bit for 2016, the cargo area has actually gotten a little bit bigger. This is about 2 cubic feet larger than it was before. As a result, we have a larger and more practical cargo area than we find in the Audi or the Mercedes. The style of the interior is very similar to what we see in other BMW models. We have, again, more optional wood trim right here on the dashboard, and then we have this infotainment display that pops up out of the dashboard. It looks sort of like a tablet computer grafted onto it. The glove compartment is a little bit larger than I had expected. It's also a slot affair, so you can see we can fit large items right there inside. I was able to fit a small tablet computer in there as well. Speaking again of that infotainment screen, you can see this does pop up out of the dashboard, sort of like a tablet computer grafted onto it, and we are in the X1 with the slightly smaller display. There is a larger wide format display, very similar to what you see in certain BMW 3 Series models as well. Obviously the displays are different sizes, but we get some additional features and functions in that up-level iDrive system as well. We get finger writing recognition, and because the screen is wider, you can actually use 2 sides of the screen to do 2 different things. Instead of a joystick-style shifter like we see in other BMW models, we have a more traditional console shifter with sort of a Cobra head-style shift button right up front. Park is all the way to the front, drive is all the way down, sport mode is 1 click over to the left. This is also where you engage manual mode by either clicking down for up or up for down. It's a little bit reversed from what we see in other cars out there. Over on the driver's side, we have one of BMW's typical 4-needle instrument clusters with the fuel gauge right over here, and then a mile per gallon gauge right over here on the right. The steering wheel is a 3-spoke design with a very interesting style. You can actually stick your finger right here under this trim section of the steering wheel. This is to sort of mirror what's going on the dashboard with some of the cut-ins and cut-outs. We have larger sport grips up top, but no sport grips on the bottom. We all knew it was only a matter of time until BMW started bringing front-wheel drive and front-wheel drive biased vehicles to the United States. Of course, they're holding off on that just a little bit longer because the X1 is available only as an all-wheel drive vehicle in the US, and that is a little bit of a twist. The only engine available under the hood is a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, so you can no longer get that 3-liter inline-6 turbo. Under the hood, you'll also find basically the same 8-speed automatic transaxle made by Aisin that we see in the Lexus RX 350 or certain Volvo models. If you were thinking that fuel economy would actually improve with this chassis, then you may be a little bit disappointed, because fuel economy actually ends up essentially the same as the last X1 with the 2-liter turbo at 26 miles per gallon combined. In other world markets, there are less powerful and more efficient versions of the X1, but in the US, this is basically all we get. Obviously, the feel of the X1 out on the road has changed versus the 2015 model year because this is a very, very different vehicle. Now again, in the United States, there is no front-wheel drive version of the X1, and you will find front-wheel drive versions of most of the competition. Even so, the previous generation X1 was the only rear-wheel drive entry in this particular segment, and as such, it had a very different position in the lineup. Now, acceleration is actually a little bit better than the last generation X1, even though this engine has lost power, and we ran from 0 to 60 in 6.8 6.2 seconds. 6.2 seconds is notably quicker than the Q3, which is quite slow for this particular segment, but it's also a little bit quicker than the Mercedes-Benz GLA, which is very light and has that dual clutch transmission. Now, if fast acceleration is your thing in your compact luxury crossover, look no further than the GLA 45 AMG. The AMG version of that GLA is incredibly quick. When it comes to braking, the X1 scored fairly well. This is a fairly light crossover. However, the tire size on this particular vehicle is limited to 225 width tires. You will find wider tires on some of the competition, and as a result, the braking distances are just a little bit longer in this. Those narrow tires also affect the handling score, and while the BMW X1 used to be tops in this segment, now the top in this segment is the Audi Q3. The Q3 has some incredibly wide tires and a very well sorted suspension. The Q3's grip is absolutely incredible for this segment, and the X1 is definitely a little bit lower. In fact, when it comes to handling, I'm actually going to put this third in this particular segment. I do think that the GLA 250 has a slightly better feel out on the road. When it comes to cabin noise, like most entries in this segment, we scored 69.5 decibels, which is a good entry, and it is fairly quiet. When you're comparing fuel economy in this segment, it is important to keep in mind that this is available only as an all-wheel drive vehicle in the United States. So it may appear that this fuel economy is a little bit lower than the competition, but in fact, this is among the best. I have to say that I am a hair disappointed with the BMW X1 out on the road, and that's primarily because the last generation X1 was so incredibly good. The last generation X1 wasn't necessarily the most practical entry in the segment, it wasn't necessarily the best priced in the segment, it didn't get the best fuel economy in the segment either, but it was by far the most fun in the segment. And this generation X1 is just a little bit different. This is now one of the better priced options in the segment. It's much more practical than it was before, it's more comfortable than it was before, it's quieter than it was before. It's just not as much fun as it was before. BMW has made the pricing fairly simple for 2016, although you can configure your X1 with just about every option you'd expect out of a modern BMW. Things start at $34,800. If you fully equip your model, you'll end up right around $50,000. This particular model is a mildly equipped model, right in the middle of that range. The Audi Q3 starts at $33,700 and the Mercedes GLA is $32,500 starting. Both of those are the closest direct competitors to the X1. Then we get some of the sideways competitors. We get the Range Rover Evoque, which is right about this size, but is trying to be a more premium entry. It doesn't start until $41,475, so it is significantly more expensive than an X1. In the Mercedes, you find fewer standard features and option packages that are much more expensive than the BMW. So by the time you've comparably configured them, your BMW can be about $4,000 less expensive than the Mercedes. Although the previous X1 definitely had a handling advantage over the Mercedes GLA, that's not going on in this generation anymore. I'd actually rank the handling very similar. Although the 8-speed automatic transmission we find in this BMW is not as exciting or as engaging as the 8-speed they use in basically every other BMW out there, it is still notably better than the dual clutch transmission we find in the Mercedes. For some reason, Mercedes has decided to limit some of the features and options in the GLA, whereas on the X1 you can basically get everything that you'd find in a luxury BMW, including a heads-up display, their finger writing recognition system on BMW's iDrive with the larger format screen. You don't get those sorts of things over there in the Mercedes, even though it will actually cost you a little bit more. Then we have the Audi Q3, which again starts at $33,700, a hair less than this. Now, Audi has a very good value proposition in this particular segment because they do equip their vehicles with very wide tires, with standard leather upholstery, and other standard features that you don't find in the base X1 or the base Mercedes GLA. One of the big things to know about the Q3 versus the X1 is when they were released worldwide. The X1 was released worldwide and then in the United States very close to one another, so we're getting it right around the same time as everybody else in the world is. The Q3 was a little bit different. They introduced it everywhere else and then they waited a number of years before finally bringing it to the United States. That means that although the Q3 is new to this market, it's not a new vehicle overall. That perhaps also explains why the Q3 is considerably slower than the BMW X1. It doesn't necessarily produce that much less horsepower, but the 0 to 60 time is more than a full second behind the X1. It actually is the slowest in this particular group. On the flip side, however, Audi puts incredibly wide tires on the Q3, and that means that it handles much better than this BMW X1 out on the road. In fact, it handles incredibly well. In general, I do prefer the better handling and slightly slower vehicle to the better accelerating but slightly poorer handling vehicle, and therefore I prefer the Q3 overall in terms of road manners. However, it is pretty close because a full second faster in the X1 is a pretty big difference between this and the Q3. That means that overall my top pick in this particular segment is the Q3 because it is a slightly better value than the BMW X1. I also like the standard feature content we get over there in the Audi, and the handling is absolutely positively incredible. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes with thetruthaboutcars.com, and this has been the 2016 BMW X1. Be sure and head on over to thetruthaboutcars.com for the full written review on the 2016 X1 and, of course, related news and reviews. I'll see you next week.